In the 1990s, the regulatory environment was much more liberal. That explains why we had the IT revolution.
Let's look at the data and try to stop being irresponsible teenagers. Let's spend less, both with our national budgets and with the EU budgets.
They had underestimated how slow we are able to work in the European Parliament. Everything has taken more time than they had imagined.
We are making our house clean by making the planet dirtier.
I was definitely hoping for more on the simplification agenda, which has been very limited. I'm guessing they did their best, but I was hoping for more.
Hello and welcome to the heart of the European Parliament here in Brussels. My name is Bartha. I'm the director of Epicenter, a network of 12 leading free market think tanks from all across Europe. And we are now almost at the end of the Danish EU Council presidency. So I think it's time to take stock of the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I'm afraid there has been plenty of all three. On the good side, we're going to talk about the regulatory simplification agenda, especially the environmental and digital omnibuses. On the bad side, we will have to talk about the next 7-year EU budget. And on the ugly side, we can't shy away from discussing the chat control proposal that the Danish presidency was pushing quite hard. So given that the Council presidency will be in focus, our panel of experts will be quite Danish heavy as well. First of all, very warm welcome to Henrik Dahl, MEP representing the Danish Liberal Alliance in the EPP group of the Parliament. I'm also delighted to have Andersen on board, who is an economist focusing on environmental policy and working for Denmark's leading classical liberal think tank, CEPOS. And last but not least, also very warm welcome to Christian Nasulea, who is the professor of economics at the University of Bucharest and the director of IES Europe in Romania. So I would like to start with the first omnibus with MEP Dahl, because there has been quite a lot of controversy around it. It has passed finally, so it looks like the European companies will have less red tape when it comes to sustainability reporting. But the way it was passed in a parliament was a bit controversial. So can you elaborate whether A, you're happy about the results, namely that it passed, and B, what do you think? Do you think the kind of right-wing coalition in the parliament will hold for the future omnibuses as well?
Very good questions. I am happy with the result because it was the best result we could achieve. We had been hoping for more, maybe getting rid of CSDDD. But in politics, the other parties are not here to promote your party platform, so you have to make compromises. And I think the compromise we made with the right-wing parties was a good compromise. It was controversial because the platform that supports the Commission wanted to be a part of the majority, but they couldn't deliver. The ballot was secret, and so we don't really know who didn't do it. We think it was S&D because they had been open about it. So we had to find a majority with the right-wing parties, and that actually held up, and it turned the final proposal a little more right-wing than it was to begin with, which makes me happy. So yeah, it could be better, but it was. Politics is the art of the possible, as Bismarck said. So this was what was possible.
So Henrik Dahl mentioned that the proposal could have been better. From a classical liberal perspective, if you have to rank the first omnibus from 1 to 10, how good it was, what are the things that you would have changed about it, and how do you rank it overall?
Yeah, so first of all, the sustainability reporting shouldn't have been a thing in the first place. So, of course, the omnibus is not a first best solution. It is definitely, we've gotten a better place than we started in the beginning. So we have moved the thresholds and also the deadlines, which is positive, and also positive that you made the coalition to actually get through with this. But basically, there is no good environmental reasons for this regulation, this sustainability reporting, because we already have very well climate regulation in the EU with the ETS. So putting on further regulation, for example, reporting requirements, does not help the climate. So there's actually no trade-off here. In reality, you're just imposing costs to businesses and thus consumers and hindering growth and prosperity in the union. And you're not even getting any climate benefits from it. So from my point of view, of course, it's good with the simplification, but we should have gone much further. And from my perspective, I would have hoped it was completely scrapped.
So all these rules are in place because people argue that without them, environmental damage would be caused. Do you actually agree with that assessment? Does increased environmental regulation actually help the environment? Or is there a way without red tape to make sure that the CO2 reduction is happening, that we actually do end up protecting our own environment?
So from the point of view of the Economist, when we talk about forcing people to do things, regardless of what kind of subject we're dealing with or what field we're working on, forcing people to behave in a certain way never really works. So what we're doing now by enforcing sustainability targets and trying to reduce pollution by way of regulation is highly hypocritical from my point of view, because we are literally cleaning up our house. You know, there are positive results that can be measured here, but at the cost of more pollution overall worldwide. So we're very happy to look the other way and not think about the fact that we are offshoring pollution by doing most of the things that we're doing in this field. And, you know, we pat ourselves on the back for the results that we obtain at home, disregarding the fact that those results would probably have been obtained without any regulation, because Europeans just like things to be clean. You know, they like their air to be clean, they like their nature to be clean, and they can afford it. But at the same time, I'm a bit bothered by the fact that many of my peers are absolutely happy to completely disregard the fact that we are making our house clean by making the planet dirtier.
So environmental and sustainability omnibuses are one thing, but the fourth omnibus is actually focusing on digital affairs. And based on the Draghi report, the main reason why the EU is lagging behind the United States when it comes to productivity growth is our tax sector, or rather the lack of it.
The lack of a tax.
So when it comes to GDPR, for example, SMEs spend about €500,000 on compliance costs just on the GDPR. And it seems that there is finally realization within EU institutions that indeed this is a problem. So the fourth omnibus is trying to address that. Do you think that we are seeing a mentality shift here in the European Union when it comes to tech regulation? Are you optimistic that the fourth omnibus is actually going to deliver on simplification?
I don't think we are correcting the design flaws, because that's the sort of the key of what you said before, is that there are basic design flaws in the green transition, because it should be based on technology and incentives instead of being based on regulation. So it's because of path dependency and stuff like that, it's really hard to correct design flaws. But these design flaws with digital regulation are the same, because you have all these overlaps, you have all these reports you have to make, and I don't think we are going to correct the basic design flaws, but I think there are some of the most absurd elements of regulation that we are going to get rid of. But I would like to go further and look into the design flaws, but that is an even more complicated political process.
And how do you go further from a policy perspective? So if you had to fix these design flaws, what are three, I wouldn't say quick fixes, but possible fixes that you can get done within the European institutions to fix our digital tech policies?
So it's really hard to say, you know, here are three things that you can do and things will be even marginally better.
Top three at least.
The main thing is the overlap. So definitely one of the things that is hopefully going to be addressed in a big way by the omnibus is the fact that you have way too much overlap between all of these different regulations, which are independently all very well-meaning in their respective fields. But if we get this done, then this will be a nice start. But beyond this, we have so many other situations where there is regulation in the tech sector that is deemed by some actors as being good just because it has a lot of effect, without looking at what that effect is, that to me, we will continue having a huge issue with European competitiveness in the foreseeable future because we're just doing things without thinking of why we're doing them. So we will continue to have over-regulation of a sector that is very difficult for politicians to regulate to begin with. And there doesn't really seem to be an intention to go to the root of the problem. I have had the opportunity to interact with quite a few people working in the Brussels bubble in different capacities. And there are those who understand, thankfully many, they understand that it is difficult, it is complicated, and probably the way forward isn't through regulation to actually deal with the actual problems that the digital sector has. But there are still so many people who just, they're stuck in a paradigm where they like that they did something and they're not willing to accept that the results of what they did just aren't there in the best case scenario, or that the results of what they did are an absolute disaster for the European economy in many other cases. So this is the big issue that I don't see us starting to even tackle with this omnibus, which, again, it's nice. It's nice we're starting, but we should be going so much further.
Well, the AI Act is a prime example of what you have mentioned. So the European Union is priding itself that it has the first legislation on AI. Ursula von der Leyen keeps on banging on about how important AI is to increase productivity growth and increase European competitiveness. But essentially, the AI Act is maximizing the computer power of certain AI development because it may pose systemic risks. So how do you actually see these two essentially opposite statements play out over the next 2 years? So is really AI and technological innovation, will it solve our productivity issue? And can we, let it freely roam? Or are we too risk averse, too cautious, put the precautionary principle too much at the forefront of EU policymaking, and we're going to be lagging behind China, US, and our global competitors?
So I don't know what the answer to that question is. The overall question I cannot answer because I don't know how far AI will actually go in helping us change the way we work. We're still waiting to figure that out. I do want to say that the results or the effects on the European economy are already here. We are being kept out of large areas of AI development because we have this AI Act. There are large companies that have just decided not to release products on the European market because they don't want to deal with, with the regulation and with all of the compliance costs that it will take for them to bring those products to market to us. And by the way, just to say this is not just me being frustrated that my Ray-Ban Metas don't have the AI assistant, which I was perfectly able to use in the US, but which does not work and probably will never work here in the EU. This is so much more than that because there's a lot of other AI that is being developed for fields that have very complex applications in industry, which we are also going to be kept out of because of something that comes from an approach to technology that I wouldn't qualify as risk averse. We're trying to keep the risk out to such an extent that we are able to just shun new technology entirely. And this is, to me, a huge problem.
So what do we do about this?
One thing that keeps puzzling me is that you should try to make a comparison with the World Wide Web. The core of the World Wide Web was invented in 1989, the hypertext markup language by Tim Berners-Lee. And in the 1990s, you have a very, very positive regulatory environment where you don't over-regulate. And that's when all these concepts that we know today, you have browsers that are pretty much like the browsers we have today. You have applications that are pretty much like the applications we know today. All this was invented in the 90s, and then it has been improved up to this day. But the regulatory environment was much more liberal in the 1990s. So I often think to myself, we should try to consider what was done right after the World Wide Web had been invented in 1989. What did the regulators do right in the 1990s? Because that explains why we had the IT revolution, because you had all these inventions that were not hampered to begin with by overregulation. Of course, you also had the IT bubble in the year 2000, because that was sort of a byproduct of the IT revolution, but that's an acceptable risk. And the regulatory environment we have now is so much less liberal.
But that's a massive problem, and that includes some of the proposals of the Danish presidency itself, chat control being the most famous, or may I say infamous one. So the whole idea that we're going to ban encryption, we're going to control the internet in the name of protecting children, it very much goes against the kind of freedom-minded nature of Denmark. So why do you think that the Danish presidency was pushing this legislative file so much?
One thing, I believe, was a strategic miscalculation, because no government wants to suffer defeat. So they had not really foreseen that the whole thing would be struck down by Germany. So it was bad planning on the part of the Danish government, I think. The other thing is that they are not as reluctant to, they are not as negative towards the state, and they are not as reluctant to regulate as liberal politicians and liberally minded people are. So it's not a bad thing to them. They will say, if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. They don't know who was the first person to say that. I will leave it to the audience to remember who said it for the first time, but it was not a nice guy.
It's not a liberal mentality, I'm afraid. So how do you push back against this mentality change, both on kind of the massive risk aversion, but also trying to essentially help citizens, help children avoid very bad content on the internet, but not regarding the trade-offs, not keeping the trade-offs in mind? Is it a mentality shift that's needed across Europe, or is it really just a kind of political policy issue that we can discuss and debate here in the European Parliament?
Well, I don't think there is any doubt that we have moved towards a stronger nanny state, also in the EU level. We see it everywhere. So I think EU and other national member states have reached like a mission creep. Like, what are we going to do? We have some economic integration. We're not nearly done, but we have shifted focus. So what can we do now? What's the next step for politicians to actually do something? And sometimes I think many politicians, unfortunately, forget that it would be more beneficial if they actually sustain from doing something and instead let people take responsibility. And also, in this case, it's obviously also a parental responsibility for what your children see online. Of course, it's a varying degree, but this trade-off is definitely unacceptable that we're discussing in this instance.
Digital regulation, obviously an extremely important part of EU policy. So is energy and environmental regulation, but it all depends on budgets and money. And during the Danish presidency, the European Commission in July introduced its first proposal for the next 7-year budget, the MFF. And I think it's safe to say it didn't go down too well across member states, neither here in the European Parliament. So from your perspective, what are the good parts of the MFF proposal? What are the bad parts of the MFF proposal? And if it were totally up to you, how would you like to see the next 7-year budget develop?
I think the main problem with the budget, you get an idea what it is, and you get an idea of the political climate if you follow the debate over the 2026 budget in France, that budget for 2026. Because except for one political party in the Assemblée Nationale, no one has the idea that you could cut costs. So the only ideas they have are for raising taxes and for distributing more money. And there's one political actor who says, maybe we could spend less. And so you are in a political environment where no one has the idea that you could spend less. So instead you can raise taxes and you can find new sources of revenue, et cetera, et cetera. And you need, and the same holds true for my friends in France, you need to introduce this concept that you can spend less. It's like communicating with teenagers. They have no idea that there is a desperate solution, which is spending less money. Have you thought about this? But it never comes to the mind of a sufficient number of my European colleagues.
So the next proposal, or the next EU budget proposal, has a budget of 2 trillion euros. Quite a bit, as you said, and no one is proposing to cut anything. If it were up to you, what are the segments of the budget that you think could be reduced?
Well, you have to look at subsidies for agriculture, and you also have to look at the cohesion funds, because those are the two very, very large posts in the budget. So those will have to be looked into. But the trouble, of course, is that this is politically impossible, because you have a very important country like France that will not change anything with agricultural policies, and you have a very large country like Romania, for instance, that is very dependent on cohesion funds. And if you mention to Romanian MEPs that you could cut the cohesion funds, they will get a heart attack. You know, it's just they will never accept that idea. So it's really easier said than done. But that would, in principle, be the solution.
So the new proposal by the European Commission wants to put agricultural funds and cohesion funds in one pot. There has been a lot of pushback against it. As an expert teaching in Romania and engaging with Romanian domestic policies a lot, how do you see that going down with the policymakers there? Is it possible to put the cohesion fund and the agricultural fund under one pot, or how would, if it were up to you, how would you reform that?
So it is possible. It's probably a very bad idea. It might actually do good for the budget of the European Union, because Romania, when it comes to cohesion funds, is very bad at actually taking those funds, but it is much better at getting the funds that come through the common agricultural policy. So the EU will save some money if they are all under the same umbrella. Now, as an economist, I do have to say that the EU overall should find it in its heart to phase out gradually the agricultural funds. We should follow the example of New Zealand and other countries which have reformed their agricultural sectors, so that we stop doing what is essentially deadweight loss when it comes to subsidies. We have these models as economists which show that subsidies are a bad idea. And using subsidies year after year is amazing to me. It's amazing that we keep persisting in doing something that economically is wrong. So that's one thing where I don't think we should put them together. I think they should be kept out, and they should both be phased out gradually. It will take years to phase out agricultural subsidies. It will potentially take even more to phase out cohesion funds. But in a European Union where my country has gone from about 30% of the EU average in terms of personal income to about 80%, I think we don't need as much money to ensure cohesion between citizens from different parts of the EU. So the data is there to justify spending less, like you were saying. So let's look at the data and try to stop being irresponsible teenagers. Let's spend less both with our national budgets and with the EU budget. So we don't start from the premise that we need to go looking for trillions of euros in order to fund the EU for another 7 years.
Do you agree with that statement? Is it possible to slowly phase out both the cohesion funds and the common agricultural policy?
Yeah, so I actually agree completely with both Henrik and Christian, because politicians sort of forget that, yes, you can spend less. So I would hope that it would be possible to phase out both the CAP and the cohesion fund, because it's all basically just state aid, and we should refrain from that. And if politicians want to spend money on certain topics, then they should prioritize. That is the job of a politician. So the job is not to just raise more revenue whenever you have a new idea. You have to prioritize whatever you think is the most valuable. And I don't think state aid in different areas is valuable, and I don't think it's necessary for the EU to increase its budgets in the next MFF.
But of course, you have to do it gradually, because the real estate market would collapse if you did it from one day to the next, because the subsidies have been capitalized. So you would have to phase them out gradually in order to prevent a total collapse of the real estate market. Because if the real estate market collapsed in large parts of Europe, all the problems we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis would be really small problems. So we can't have that.
Okay, so let's assume that in the long term, you are able to reduce the EU budget, but it's instead of 2 trillion, it's 1.5 trillion. you still have to raise the revenue for that. Where should the money come from?
Well, one of the things that we find acceptable would be if the European Union collected the revenue from carbon quotas. So that would be an acceptable thing to do, because we also have to be honest and say we need to we have a problem with our defense industry, and we have a problem with Russia, and we have to solve these problems fairly quickly. And unless one of the things that is quite necessary to develop a defense industry is to have contracts with the defense companies, so they will invest in building a new plant or the next generation of weapon systems. But unless we do that, we will be very vulnerable to Russia, because we have under-invested in security for 3 decades. So we really have a problem there.
So indeed, there is a lack of money in certain areas. It's probably not agriculture policy, and it's probably not cohesion money, but defense, for example, is something that a lot of classical liberals would sign up to.
None of my liberal friends like to say this, but sometimes if you would like Rheinmetall or some other defense company to build a new factory, you have to award them a 10-year contract, which has a certain value, because otherwise they will not invest in building a new factory. And we would like them to build a new factory because we would like to buy their tanks and what else they can do. So we have to award contracts in another way if we want to have a positive interaction with the defense sector. That's how the system works.
So sticking to the topic of revenue raising for the next EU budget, you have worked a lot on ETS reform and how to change and liberalize our environmental regulations. Is the ETS income a possible source to plug the hole in the EU budget, or where would you actually raise the money from?
Yeah, so using revenue from the ETS is not a sustainable way forward due to the fact that we are phasing out carbon emissions. So it wouldn't finance the EU for very long, because that's the whole thing. So you would have some perverted incentives if you wanted to finance the EU by something that you actually want less of. So I wouldn't think that would be the best way, but I think a more reasonable way would, of course, be to have member states contributing to the budget, because that would be the most direct way of seeing what are you paying for this. The EU should not go out and raise taxes in the member states, because that would be a slippery slope towards more centralized EU. The same with the fact if the EU proposes more joint debt, that would also lead us to more centralization. And I don't think we've had that discussion yet, if that's what we want. At least I'm not sure that's, from a Danish perspective, a wishful outcome.
So the EU does need the money. It wants its own revenues. Based on the recent Commission proposal, it wants to tax e-waste to support the next EU budget. It wants to increase excise duties. It wants to increase taxes on large European companies. A lot of them seem to go against the competitiveness agenda of the European Commission. So what do you think about these new taxes that would contribute to the EU budget? And if you dislike them, what would be your proposal to fund the EU budget?
So a good principle to go by is no new taxes. This should be a place to start from. We already have, when it comes to excise duties, we have a schedule for ever-increasing excise duties on certain products. I'm not sure I feel very comfortable with that schedule either, but there are already all of these taxes which are not negligible, which we have. I also do not think that the EU should start levying taxes directly. So this is something that should remain with the member states, and then the member states should contribute to the EU budget. And that's, in my view, where we should discuss how, based on what principle, based on gross national income, based on the level of VAT collected, based on pollution, based on all sorts of criteria that we could use for that. But we need to set up a system that is designed to give the incentives to the bureaucrats and the politicians to be budgetarily responsible. They have to be responsible for the way they treat the budget, of the countries, and they have to be very responsible with the way they treat the budget of the European Union. And to me, this means that we need to say there's a limit. This is the upper limit of how high this can go. You're not going to put any new taxes. You will get more money when the EU economy works better. If you make rules that make the EU economy work better, then you will get more money. That's the overarching principle to me that we should be focusing on when we design the MFF for now and the MFFs of the future as well.
When national governments are not willing to raise taxes, but they need the revenue, they often run budget deficits. And that's now also very much a discussion here in Brussels that Europe should have Eurobonds and common debt. Do you think that because of this discussion being so difficult about increased taxes, and that's a no-go for a lot of national governments, we will end up with more Eurobonds?
Well, so I'm afraid of it, but I think it would be a very dangerous path to go. So we already have an enormous budget debt crisis in the EU. The average debt in 2023 was more than 80% relative to GDP, and the rules are it's not supposed to go over 60%. So we already have a system where the rules are not complied with, and then we have the discussion of if we take on joint debt, what does it mean? It's a form of redistribution. It's not very clear how it's redistributed, but it will be that obviously the countries would be liable to each other's debts, but it would also create some common problems that each country would be more motivated to take on more debt on behalf of the entire union because everyone is there to pay for it. So one way to solve that problem would be to have the EU to say how much debt there can be, and then you would also need one institution that determines where the revenue from the common debt would go, and then you have a much more centralized European Union than we have had so far, where we have refrained from taking on joint debt with the exception of the COVID-19. And we are also seeing the consequences of this now with the joint debt. Now they want to raise the budgets because we have to pay back the debt. So it is definitely not a good idea to take on debt to finance these investments that you want to do, because someone has to pay the debt. So if you do have political priorities, then you have to find ways of financing it which are not taking on more debt, because we cannot bear more debt in the EU.
And how do you see this discussion developing in the parliament itself? So you mentioned the defense industry before, and obviously geopolitical challenges are very much there, and it's often used as a justification why we need Eurobonds. Is that a good enough justification?
I think the discussion will run at least in two tracks, because there will be sort of the intellectual discussion that we're having now, and on an intellectual level, I totally agree with you. You barely mentioned the problem of moral hazard. So like you have joint economy with everyone on your dorm floor, including the most stupid, irresponsible person living on the same floor as you in the dorm, and sometimes the EU works like this. So you have to, in order to avoid moral hazard, you have to do all the things you have outlined. But then there's also sort of the political track that we have to discuss. And I think politically you will have Eurobonds because you have security problems, and as a general understanding that you have to solve some of these problems before 2030. So from a political point of view, I'm afraid it will happen, because the alternative will be to do nothing when it comes to rearming Europe. And it's going to be very, very hard to defend in a number of countries that you are doing absolutely nothing. So in the end, what will happen is what always happens, that you have sort of a trade-off between what your economic advisors will tell you and what politically makes sense. And we are going to end somewhere in that in that landing zone, if you will. That's politically what's going to happen.
And how do you do Eurobonds in the least economically damaging way, where you have the least moral hazard, if you like?
Well, you have to be responsible. You have to assign more responsibility to individual member states. So because moral hazard comes in when you can make decisions and others have to bear the cost. So if you have to create a system where you can't make very far-reaching decisions and leave it to everybody else to bear the cost of the decisions that you have made.
So we have talked about environmental policy, we have talked about tech policy, we have talked about the next EU budget. But I would like to have a proper assessment of the performance of the Danish Council presidency. And given that we have two Danes around the table, it may be a challenging question, especially because your party is part of the governing coalition as well. But if you have to rank the performance of the presidency from 1 to 10, how satisfied are you?
I had to correct a mistake. There are two liberal parties in Denmark, and it's the other liberal party that's in the coalition. So
you can be more critical.
I can criticize them very freely, but I think I will give you an anecdote, because when the former Prime Minister, Anthony Eden, who was Prime Minister in the UK, was a very old man, he was approached by a journalist, just like you, who wanted Eden to answer the question, so what shaped your career, your brilliant career? And Eden said, events, my dear boy, events. And I think what the Danish presidency has found out is that what they have been able to do has very much been shaped by events, by things they could not control. Because I know they had underestimated how slow we are able to work in the European Parliament, for instance. They had underestimated that you have Omnibus 1 that is not accepted by one coalition, and then you have to find a new coalition. Everything is delayed. So everything has taken more time than they had imagined, and reality has been more complex than the planning. And so they will end up like every presidency ends in a tragedy, because every country was hoping for more. And they will also say, outside of the earshot of journalists, that they were hoping for more.
How much more were you hoping for, Lina?
Well, of course, a lot was promised, so one could hope for more than actually was delivered. If you look into the program beforehand and then what has actually been the output, there is a large difference, and I was definitely hoping for more on the simplification agenda, which has been very limited. But I don't think we should forget the fact that a presidency doesn't really matter that much. I guess I'm very aware of it because it's the Danish presidency, but it's not like they're suddenly the leaders of Europe. So it is also very limited of how much influence a presidency can have. And exactly as Henrik describes, everything is slow. 6 months is not very long. So I'm guessing they did their best, but I was hoping for more compared to the promises made or the program made.
As the only non-Danish expert around the table, I will ask for you for a number. 1 to 10, how well did the Danish presidency perform?
I will be a politician on this, although I'm not a politician, and refrain from giving a grade because, as you both said, there were many factors which influenced the little effect that a presidency can have on the functioning of the EU. So, to be kind, as I tend to be with my students back home, I'll definitely give a passing grade. And I guess that's the best we can hope for, given how complex the situation is and how little can be done in such a short span of time. Now, we do hope that the European institutions in general will start working more and more and better in the future. I think that's really the main thing we should focus on. And going back to what we were discussing, this does mean that people in the EU bubble understand better what goes on back home, and that they understand better that very good rules, very simple rules that will help the European economy in general prosper are what we expect of them. This is what people back home, in my country at least, are looking for when they look over the fence to see what's going on over there in Brussels. What are they up to this time? So hopefully we just get more of that.
Well, we know that there's never a dull moment in European politics, and I'm sure that the many fantastic people who have been running the Danish Council presidency are really looking forward to a well-deserved Christmas break. I will be definitely dreaming of a white Christmas, and the red tape really ruins the vibe. So I'm glad that we have a little bit less of it, but there is really plenty of more to do. And I'm sure that all three of you will be helping massively with the simplification agenda going forward during the Cypriot presidency as well. But for now, a massive thank you for all three of you for your insights. I really enjoyed this conversation. And if you have enjoyed it too, don't forget to click subscribe and follow Epicenter on our social media channels. But for now, thank you very much, and see you next year back here live from the European Parliament.